Hey everyone, and welcome to Chef AJ Live. I'm your host, Chef AJ, and this is where I introduce you to amazing people like you who are doing great things in the world that I think you should know about. My guest today has been on the show before, but it was a very long time ago, so I'm so glad to have him back. He is a cardiologist, a plant-based cardiologist from Colorado. Cardiologist from Colorado. I like the sound of that. His name is Dr. Andrew Freeman, and he's going to be giving a wonderful presentation about the year in plants 2022. Please welcome him to the show. It's very nice to see you again.
Well, thank you so much for having me. It's always a pleasure to be here amongst friends. So I'm going to start sharing my screen so you all can see.
Wow, you just want to get right into it, don't you?
Well, yeah, I think I want to leave some time for questions at the end for
Of
sure.
course,
So
I'm just pulling your leg, so
no,
thank you.
no worries. Well, and for those of you that don't recall, each year I actually comb through the literature and try to put together a talk on all the evidence. And the truth is, the vast majority of evidence and published studies are very seldom reviewed by general practitioners in practice. And so a lot of things get missed, and it's just mind blowing how much there is each and every year. So I also want to point out that there are many well done randomized trials that show the effect of plant based diets and improve health outcomes, and there are some that are observational that are not directly linked but show significant relationships. So again, sometimes it's impossible to fully adjust for every possible variable in the world. This is an interesting sign. I always tell people that the world is very different these days, and having these webinars and virtual ways to connect with people are so very important. This was at a local bookshop, which I thought was quite entertaining. And then before I jump into the newest stuff, I thought it was interesting. Every so often, I have an old paper or manuscript cross my desk, and this was from 1981 of all times, and it said that the authors concluded that having abnormal EKG responses is not necessarily associated with a poor prognosis. There's rarely a need to resort to cardiac surgery because medical management is highly successful and associated with a low mortality. So just having coronary disease, which is so very common as the number one killer of both men and women in the United States, doesn't always necessitate the need for stents or bypass surgery. And the mortality in this particular study was really low. So it's just interesting to see how we've sort of come full circle. And I always show this slide almost every talk I give because people always say to me, well, doc, where do I get my protein? And it's such a misnomer. If you ever go out to a restaurant, even those that are plant-based, they'll ask you what your protein of choice is. But there's really protein in everything, and including green leafy vegetables. Of course, where does the cow, the pig, the chicken, the get their protein from? It's from eating all the greens and vegetables out there. And pound for pound, remember that dry weight spinach, kale, broccoli actually have an enormous amount of protein, even compared to things like beef and chicken. And it's also important that we understand that it's time for us doctors to change, right? I was certainly trained by a number of doctors that told me that we needed to eat meat to increase our iron stores or improve our blood counts or whatever it may be. And these very same doctors also trained during the time when cigarettes were considered healthy. So just because doctors are smoking cigarettes doesn't mean that they also need to tell you to eat meat and vice versa. And I hope that parallel makes sense there. So interestingly, every year or so, the American Heart Association puts out its statistics, and of course, the statistics lag behind reality because it takes time to collect the data and then collate it. But it turns out that roughly 50% of cardiovascular disease, roughly 50% of Americans have some form of cardiovascular disease, a lot of which is high blood pressure, which is really the silent killer. And cardiovascular disease prevalence, excluding hypertension, is around 9 or 10%. But an enormous amount of patients. I mean, imagine that 1 in 2 people have high blood pressure, and we need to do a lot better about that. And if you're not sure about the stats, the stat that I share with my patients is for every 20 points you go above 120 on the top number of your blood pressure, your risk for dying doubles. So at 120, that's the index number. At 140, it's double. At 160, it's quadruple. And at 180, it's 8 times. So pretty amazingly high risk factor. And it is also the underlying cause for an enormous amount of deaths in the United States every year, and it claims more lives every year than all forms of cancer and chronic lower respiratory disease combined. And the expenditures are just insane. We're talking about $363 billion. And if you look even further at this, roughly 60% of non-Hispanic black females and 60% of non-Hispanic black males had some form of cardiovascular disease. So there's a significant socioeconomic divide and disparity, especially even in treatments. And in 2018, coronary heart disease remains the leading cause of deaths attributable to cardiovascular disease in the United States. And it is the leading global cause of death and accounted for 19 million deaths in 2019. Cardiovascular disease and stroke accounted for 13% of the total health expenditures in 1 year, 2014 to 2015, which is much more than any diagnostic group. So pretty sobering news. And as we look even further, this is interesting little pearls that come out from the CDC, but believe it or not, 95% of U.S. adults did eat some amount of vegetable on any given day, but only 2/3 said the same of fruit, which is actually down significantly from 20 years ago. And remember that, of course, the USDA recommends up to 13 servings of fruits and vegetables a day, and very few people hit that, sadly. And it turns out that the earlier we start, the better we do. So from the Cardia study, following people for 32 years, long-term adherence to a plant-based diet lowered the risk for heart disease by more than half, and starting from an earlier age, lowered it by 61% through middle age. So I want to point out that there's really no way to get this kind of an outcome or magnitude of a result with traditional sort of medication-based medical approaches. In this study of 123,000 postmenopausal women followed for 15 years, if they followed the portfolio diet, which was one of the very first plant-based diets ever introduced in the medical literature, it lowered the risk by heart disease for heart disease up to 11%. And 6 prospective cohort studies that were pulled together around 30,000 participants, if eggs, processed meat, and unprocessed red meat or poultry were substituted, and they got nuts, whole grains, legumes, or even fish, they had significantly lower cardiovascular disease, up to 54% less, depending on the amount of substitution. Now, this study hit a lot of the mainstream media, so I'm hoping you saw it. It was in Nature Food. It was a new analysis, and it said that substituting 10% of daily caloric intake from beef and processed meat for fruit, vegetables, nuts, legumes, and selected seafood could offer substantial health improvements of up to 48 minutes gain per person per day, and a 33% reduction in dietary carbon footprint. And interestingly, if you ate one hot dog, you lost 35 minutes on your life. One hot dog. So think about all those $1.50 Costco hot dogs that have gone into people's bodies over the years. Whereas if you ate a peanut butter and jelly, the good old PB&J, you added 33 more minutes. So here's the chart here, and you can see that if you were above this dashed line across the middle, you gain life, and if you were below it, you lost life. So here's cured meats and poultry. Here's a Frankfurter sandwich, which is that dark orange over there. And then fruits are way above. And if you come here, nuts and seeds are way above. And peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, surprisingly, are way above. So surprising, or not surprising, we really need to put warning signs, I think, on a number of our processed foods that we serve regularly. Those harmless ballpark Franks are probably not so harmless. And finally, the European Society of Cardiology released their guidelines, and you can see here they have some amazingly new highlighted recommendations. And when things get Class 1A evidence or Class 1A recommendations, it means there's incredibly strong evidence for the approach. And so they recommend a healthy diet, no surprise, a Mediterranean diet or similar. They reduce salt. It is recommended to choose a more plant-based food pattern, restricting alcohol, and then if you need to eat fish instead of processed meat, perhaps. But I guess what I would tell you is that all of the major professional societies now really endorse a plant-forward or predominantly plant-based diet. And a true Mediterranean diet is a plant-based diet when it's done well. The American Mediterranean diet is, feta and lamb in large quantities, which is not a true Mediterranean diet. And here they are just zoomed in a little. And then, of course, every year there's new studies about cancer, the number 2 killer, and it turns out that heart disease and cancer may share some of the same pathophysiologic mechanisms. And a lot of that also has to do with the environment that people live in. You may have genes for something, but it doesn't necessarily mean it has to express unless it's in the environment, which, of course, a lot of that is what we eat. So in this particular study of over 300,000 women followed for 14 years, 13,000 plus had breast cancer, and for every 1 standard deviation of inflammatory food they ate, it increased the risk by 4%, up to a 12% greater risk in those eating the most inflammatory foods. And their risks were even higher for those that were already postmenopausal. How about men? So in prostate cancer, in this particular study, they calculated a Mediterranean diet score adjusted for age, tumor length, and their PSA levels. And it turns out that if you had a higher Mediterranean diet score, it had a lower risk for grade progression in the disease. So 1 unit increase in the Mediterranean diet score, meaning you ate better, had a 10% lower risk of progression for all men, which is pretty amazing. Now, you know that in the United States, we share this awful distinction with several other countries, but we have the highest rates of colon cancer in young people, like in their 40s. So it's a big concern, and a lot of it has to do with our diet. So in this 120,000 men and women study, 26 years followed, cancer cases prevented almost 30% when healthy lifestyles combined with screening. So pretty powerful way. And further, in this study from the UK Biobank cohort of about 350,000 participants, there was 42% less colon cancer when red and processed meat consumption were reduced and fruit and vegetables were increased. Now, the good news is each and every year there are studies published about coffee, and by and large, almost all of them are positive. This was a good one. In about 46,000 participants that had had heart attack or stroke, green tea consumption was inversely associated with all-cause mortality. And you can see that the hazard ratios go down if you have 7 cups or more per day, a 62% risk reduction. And it turned out that in this study, green tea was good for stroke or heart attack survivors, and coffee was good for heart attack survivors and those without either. Here was an interesting one here from the UK Biobank, a dose-dependent association between self-reported coffee intake and some of the markers that we measure for cholesterol. And the highest lipid levels were seen when people drank more than 6 cups a day. So I would say that it appears that some coffee is good, but 6 cups might be just a wee bit much. But interestingly, each additional cup of habitual coffee consumed actually lowered the risk for arrhythmia, including atrial fibrillation and supraventricular tachycardia. So for years, we would always tell people to avoid coffee, and unless you're really sensitive to it, you don't need to. It turns out it actually may reduce your risk, but it's habitual. The same trend is also seen in coffee drinkers and blood pressure. If you never drink coffee and then drink a bunch of coffee, your blood pressure might go up, but if you drink it habitually, it doesn't seem to affect blood pressure. Now, in this new British Medical Journal study of about 150,000 people followed for about 10 years, those who ate the most refined grains had much higher mortality, about 1/3 more, and more cardiovascular events, whereas those who had the least amount. So the goal is really to get rid of the garbage carbs or garbage and focus really on whole, minimally processed foods. So no significant associations were found between intakes of whole grains or white rice and health outcomes. And interestingly, that white rice has been consumed for generations in Asia without adverse events, but I still recommend brown rice for my patients. Now, more and more people are starting to do intermittent fasting, and for a lot of people, it helps them get through that plateau phase of weight loss. In this particular study of 50 participants, the mean body mass index was 35. Remember, 25 is normal. They were mostly female, and those who adhered to the intervention 5 days a week had greater weight loss than those with lower adherence. 26% of the sample lost at least 5% of their body weight at 12 weeks. This was an interesting one here. So this was done at the National Institutes of Health Clinical Center, and they took 20 adults, just a small study, and they randomized it to consume a minimally processed plant-based low-fat diet, so 10% fat, 75% carbohydrates, with a high glycemic load, or a minimally processed animal-based ketogenic low-carb diet with a low glycemic load. And they were on for 2 weeks, and then they switched after 2 weeks. And the low-fat diet actually led to significantly less energy intake than the low-carb diet, and participants overall ate less on the plant-based diet. So food for thought, people seem to do better overall when they eat more plants. In this particular study, this was another Women's Health Initiative study. They measured protein intake and the types of protein in about 100,000 postmenopausal women. And those who consumed the most plant-based protein from nuts, legumes, and other plant-based foods were much less likely to die from cardiovascular disease, dementia, and other causes when compared to those who consumed the least. And consuming eggs, dairy products, and red meat was associated with a higher risk of death from heart disease, cancer, and dementia. And results also showed that swapping animal protein with plant protein sources lowered mortality. How about in this interesting one, another UK Biobank study of about 475,000 middle-aged Britons? Every 70 grams of unprocessed red meat and processed meat consumed daily raised the risk of raised the risk of heart disease by 15% and diabetes by 30%, even after accounting for other lifestyle factors. And every 30 grams of poultry increased the risk of developing reflux by 17% and diabetes by 14%. So again, time after time, study after study, very similar trends. Now again, processed meat seems to still be widely available no matter where you go, and 13 articles compared meat intake with heart disease incidence and mortality rates. And 50 grams per day of processed meat and red meat increases the risk of cardiovascular disease by 18% and 9% respectively. So again, we really should consider putting warning signs on some of these hot dog stands that are available everywhere. You guys have heard me talk, if you've heard me speak in the past, about the dangers of milk and dairy, but in this particular analysis, they found that the most common cause of fatal anaphylaxis, which is a super severe allergic reaction in older children across the UK, was due to cow's milk. And hospital admissions by food allergies rose each year, with the largest amongst children younger than 15. And whereas fatalities are down, 26% of deaths were caused by cow's milk allergy, which is now the most common single cause of food anaphylaxis-related death in the United Kingdom, which has also resulted in a 300% increase in prescriptions for emergency anaphylaxis treatment like EpiPens and others. And then again, we've seen this before about bone density, but greater than 2,000 multi-ethnic women across the menopause transition. They looked at dairy foods, and it turns out that dairy food intake was neither associated with femoral and spine bone density loss nor the risk of fractures. So you do not need to consume milk to keep your bones healthy. And interestingly, from the Adventist Health Study, and as you may know, Seventh-day Adventists are plant-based by default, so they're always a lovely population to study, 34,000 participants, analysis showed that women on a vegan diet who took both calcium and vitamin D supplements did not have a greater risk of fractures when compared to non-vegetarian women. So it's possible to do that. And of course, you can get lots and lots of calcium from green leafy vegetables and vitamin D precursors from both sunshine and mushrooms. So there's lots of ways to do this without so much supplementation if you desire. Now, you may know that fatty liver is on the rise. In fact, the most common cause for hepatitis in the United States is non-alcoholic steatohepatitis, or fatty liver, which typically precedes the development of diabetes. And so in this particular case of about 300 participants, they were divided into a Mediterranean, a Green Med, or quote, healthy guideline diet. And they followed their prevalence of non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, and it declined significantly in the plant-based Mediterranean diet. So again, I would say eating a lower fat, whole food, plant-based diet is fantastic for fatty liver and of course, diabetes. In this 26 participant study with the similar disease, they followed those on a vegan diet, tracked them for 6 months. Weight loss was significant, and the liver enzymes, which are what shows up in fatty liver disease, trended towards normal levels. And it's interesting, this was in The Lancet, which is also a European medical journal, and they're starting to really focus on planetary health because, of course, health as human beings depends very much on planetary health. So in this particular study, they came up with the fact that 6 million diet-related deaths a year could be prevented by 2040 if 9 countries, representing 50% of the world's population and 70% of the world's emissions, adopted climate policies that promoted plant-based diets. And these include Brazil, China, Germany, India, Indonesia, Nigeria, South Africa, the UK, and of course, the US. So think about that. If we could get these 9 countries to make the change, it would be amazing. You may have seen in the last week or so, Biden is being urged to put forward a plant-based diet to reduce carbon emissions. Maybe we will get that into legislature, who knows. So in this particular interesting study, it was 16 weeks long. They randomly assigned participants to a vegan diet or a Mediterranean diet. All participants were overweight, no diabetes, no calorie restrictions, so they could eat what they like. But participants on the vegan diet lost 13 pounds, while those on the Mediterranean diet had no change, and there was more fat mass lost on the vegan diet. And drops in LDL, the bad cholesterol, was seen on the vegan but not the Mediterranean diet. So again, an interesting study, small group, but nonetheless powerful. How about in this study of about 237,000 men, 180,000 women, greater dietary plant intake reduced overall mortality, and for every 1 standard deviation of plant protein that was increased, 5% less death. Lower overall mortality was attributable to substitution of plant protein for egg protein, believe it or not, and red meat protein. So again, lots of very powerful studies in the last year showing how powerful the substitution of diets can be. In this study, 3,800 adults in Australia, habitual intake of nitrate-rich vegetables, spinach, lettuce, and kale, they actually had 11% stronger lower limb strength as well as 4% faster walking speed compared to those that did not have, excuse me, this same dietary nitrate intake. And you may have seen, if you've watched movies like The Game Changers and others, but more and more athletes are going towards a plant-based approach for just these reasons. Now, it doesn't take much to walk into any convenience store, gas station, supermarket and find row after row after row of ultra-processed foods. And 3,000 adults free from cardiovascular disease were followed, and it turns out that on average, participants consume 7.5 servings per day of ultra-processed foods at baseline. And for every additional daily serving of processed foods, such as ice cream, hot dogs, donuts, there was an increased risk for cardiovascular disease, coronary heart disease, and death by as much as 9%. And I always tell people, you just walk into the doctor's lounge or the nurse's lounge in any hospital and you will see donuts, ice cream, and hot dogs and all these other things, sadly. So interestingly, in Australia, they did a study of about 8,000 people, and they called moderate fruit intake 2 servings a day. They actually had better blood sugar control and about a little bit more than a third of a chance of developing diabetes after 5 years. And I would tell you that I would love for each person to consume 4 to 6 or 8 servings of fruits a day and another 4 to 6 or 8 servings of vegetables a day. The more seems to be better. Now, you've seen me talk in years past about eggs and how the more eggs you eat, the more diabetes there might be. In this particular study of about 500,000 people, they were recruited from 6 states, 2 additional cities. Intakes of whole eggs, egg white substitutes, and cholesterol were assessed, and each intake of an additional half or whole egg per day led to 7% more mortality, cardiovascular disease mortality, and cancer mortality. And every increase of 300 milligrams of dietary cholesterol was associated with similar degrees, so 19, 16, and 24% all caused cardiovascular and cancer mortality. So big magnitude effects. And remember, one egg could easily have 200 to 300 milligrams of cholesterol. And so the authors say that their findings suggest limiting cholesterol intake and replacing whole eggs with egg whites or substitutes or alternative protein sources is far better for long-term survival, and I would very much agree. And I would tell you that a lot of the egg whites and egg substitutes still contain lots of harmful things, so I would really try your best to switch. And there's a whole variety of products out there now that are not very high fat or high salt that are actually surprisingly tasty. This was an interesting one. This was in the Journal of the American Heart Association, and it was a review, and it talked about the cardiovascular harm from egg yolk and meat more than just the cholesterol and saturated fat. And they said that egg yolk and red meat should be avoided and meat intake limited to prevent cardiovascular disease and stroke because of the interaction of impaired kidney function with toxic metabolites of the biome in the intestine. That advice is particularly important for people with impaired renal function, including the elderly. And adopting a more plant-based diet would improve sustainability of food sources and reduce harm to the environment from a meat-based diet. And so additional studies were done this year, 21,000 participants, 8 years followed, and if they had more than 4 eggs a week, they had 50% more all-cause death compared to those who consume 0 eggs or even 1 egg per week. 2 to 4 per week increased the risk for cancer and all-cause heart disease mortality by 22 and 43%. And for participants with high blood pressure and high cholesterol, 1 egg per week increased mortality. So I would stay away from them if you can. So this was an interesting study with walnuts. So the study used machine learning techniques using an application of artificial intelligence to look at biomarkers and blood samples that were associated with walnut consumption. So they took 1,833 participants from the Mediterranean Diet Study, PREDIMED, and they looked at 19 different metabolites, and they were associated with walnut consumption. And then they looked at that metabolite profile and found that the higher they were, the less diabetes there were. So there were 17% less diabetes and 29% less cardiovascular disease with walnuts, interestingly enough. How about strawberries? So this was an interesting study, and I love seeing randomized trials with strawberries. So this is a 4-week crossover study, 3 arms for 4 weeks. Control strawberry powder, which was just dried strawberries, 1 serving, or 2.5 servings, and 33 subjects completed all the servings, and significant reductions in fasting insulin following the high-dose strawberry phase, and particle concentrations of some of the cholesterol were significantly decreased after the high-dose strawberry phase. there's something so very enjoyable for me to say high dose strawberries as instead of high dose, X medicine or Y medicine. So very enjoyable. So mushrooms, I mentioned it earlier, but it turns out that they're healthful, right? So almost 16,000 participants. Participants who ate mushrooms had lower all-cause risk of mortality after adjusting for lots of different factors. In fact, 16% less death. And as I mentioned, they contain precursors for vitamin D. It's important, though, we have now figured out how to make plant-based foods and plant-based versions of virtually everything we might encounter. So for those of us who are not always vegan, you can now find vegan versions of virtually everything. And so in this particular study, 3 different studies following 200,000+ adults, all participants had no cardiovascular disease or cancer at baseline, follow for 20 years. If you ate a healthy plant-based diet, and not necessarily exclusively plant-based, it lowered a person's overall stroke risk by 10%, but unhealthy plant-based eating raised the stroke risk by 5%. And this has been seen in other studies before. So in general, do your best to stay away from the overly processed plant-based foods. So how about fish oil? So for years people were taking fish oil. They thought it was going to maybe protect them against atrial fibrillation. And it turns out in this particular study that there was no significant difference when they looked at people who were getting fish oil versus not. So I really recommend limiting it. Of course, if you're vegan, you may still need your EPAs and DHAs, and you can get that from walnuts or flax seeds. But do your best to avoid fish oil. Another processed meat study from the Pure study said that if you consumed 150 grams, so 3 hot dogs of processed meat a week, you died by more than 50%, believe it or not. So just eye-opening data. And 3 hot dogs is sometimes a single meal for some people. We know from many years of study in this Regards trial that the Southern diet is truly the killer. And if you look across the southeastern United States, it is truly the stroke belt. This is where people have large amounts of cardiovascular disease. And it turns out that the Southern diet pattern in this particular study was highly associated with the risk of sudden cardiac death, almost 50% more. So it's really important to avoid that. The Southern diet has a lot of superfoods in it, but the moment you add lard, ham hocks, butter, oil, large quantities of oils, and sugars, you end up with a very highly processed, dangerous meal. This was an interesting one. You don't hear much about hepatitis E, but in those positive for hepatitis E, 97% of them reported pork consumption. In this blood sample that was for blood donation, donors who did not eat the meat had all negative results, interestingly. How about ultra-processed food and high blood pressure? So this was 6,000 participants. Black adults who were in the top 25% of all participants for total ultra-processed food consumption were 55% more likely than white adults to have incident hypertension. More black adults compared to white adults fell within the top 25% of all participants, and men and adults who had less education, lower levels of physical activity, or a lower household income annually were much more likely to regularly consume ultra-processed foods. How about COVID? Well, you may have seen there's lots of data that is emerging about how plant-based diets seem to be quite protective in COVID. So if you look at the study of healthcare workers from 6 countries with significant COVID exposure, following a plant-based diet or even a pescatarian diet had a 73% or 59% lower odds of moderate to severe COVID severity compared with the participants who did not follow this diet. If you look within 150 days of a COVID infection, a meatpacking plant that produced beef or pork or chicken increased their infections in the county significantly, and meatpacking plants increased per capita COVID infection rates by up to 160% in their respective counties. And if you look, 334,000 infections were attributable to meatpacking plants with an associated morbidity cost of $11 billion, impacting more than 500,000 employees, and disproportionate effects amongst people of color, including Hispanic, Black, and Asian staff. Another study of over 500,000 participants using smartphone-based COVID symptom study trackers looked at a diet analysis, and high diet quality was associated with lower risk of COVID-19 and severe COVID-19, so 9% less COVID and 61% less severe COVID. Another interesting study, the gut flora continues to show promise as a really important target, and in this particular study, people who had Crohn's, ulcerative colitis, irritable bowel in the general population, it turns out that processed foods and animal-derived foods were consistently associated with higher abundances of different endotoxins from bad bacteria, but the opposite was found in those who were eating more plant-based foods with short-chain fatty acid producing bacteria, which was showing a healthy gut flora. This is an interesting article that came out this year in JACC, the Journal of the American College of Cardiology, and it said that coronary disease is pandemic and preventable, and genetic risk for coronary disease can be determined at birth, and those at highest genetic risk have been shown to respond to lifestyle changes and statin therapy with up to a 50% reduction in cardiovascular events. This is a very mainstream journal where they're talking about the effects of lifestyle and how genetics don't have to necessarily hold you hostage. And if you look even in their study here, they have it right in their central figure, which I think is important, favorable lifestyle, physical activity. Pretty amazing. And then, of course, this continues to be an ongoing myth that, if your kids are plant-based or vegan, they're not going to grow and they're going to fail to thrive. And it turns out that a well-planned vegan diet with supplementation as needed is likely to provide the recommended amounts of nutrients that are required. This was interesting. So in Colorado, there was a meat out declaration, and it turns out that it ignited all of the dairy and beef farmers, and they all wanted to have meat in. In California, this was interesting. 1,350 monthly entrees from California's 25 largest K-12 school districts found that ultra-processed and fast food items like cheeseburgers, meat and cheese pizzas, chicken nuggets, deli meat, hot dogs are still among the most widely offered items on the menu. 4% only were plant-based, and most of those were nut or seed butter and jelly, and 16% contained processed meat. It's just mind-blowing what kids are eating these days, and we can do a whole lot better. And the fact that hot dogs are even available in schools is just mind-blowing. And it turns out that the carbon footprint also mirrors this, so maybe they'll push it. But if you look, if they eat a cheeseburger, an enormous carbon footprint versus bean and cheese entrees, which are not even fully plant-based, markedly less, believe it or not. And if they make a big burger swap, and this is from the Friends of the Environment here, but beef burger versus black bean burger, it's some enormous carbon savings, believe it or not. Now, believe it or not, I couldn't believe this. I was impressed to see that McDonald's is actually working with some of the plant-based producers to offer a plant-based option, which of course is not necessarily healthy, but is much better than what's available. I mean, believe it or not, the French fries at McDonald's are actually not vegan. They contain beef tallow. So this was a surprising news release. Someone sent me this meme I thought it was clever. It's how to eat mayonnaise, which, as you may know, is ground up eggs, throw it in the garbage, and use an avocado instead. And then this is a real billboard I saw on the highway, how eating animals causes pandemics. Very interesting and worthwhile to pursue looking into this. And then, of course, I would be remiss, as I always would say, if I didn't talk about some of the other aspects of lifestyle. So this came out this year. It was meditation and cardiovascular risk reduction. And the authors say that studies of meditation suggest a possible benefit in cardiovascular risk, although some of the studies are not as strong as others, and given the low costs and low risks, it should be considered an adjunct to guideline-directed cardiovascular risk reduction. It turns out that being outside, even during the pandemic, 2 hours a day was the new 10,000 steps, believe it or not. Even listening to nature without people decreased stress and annoyance and improved health and positive effective outcomes. And you may have seen this. This was last summer, and I think we're due for a similar swell perhaps in the near future, but the ground temperatures hit 118 degrees in the Arctic Circle. So we need to make some serious changes in a hurry. And, it doesn't take much. These happen all the time. This was last summer. 8.5 million pounds of chicken recalled due to listeria. And then, of course, I always like to share this, especially with my colleagues, but it turns out that if you work more than 55 hours or more per week, it's a serious health hazard, says the WHO, the World Health Organization. And in a first global analysis of the loss of life and health associated with working long hours, they estimated that in 2016, nearly 400,000 people died from stroke and 350,000 from heart disease as a result of working more than 55 hours a week. And in 2000 to 2016, the number of deaths from cardiovascular disease due to working increased, as well as for that of stroke. So if you're like a lot of folks in medicine or in other careers, working less may be better. And I know Europe and other places are certainly trying this 4-day work week. Hopefully that really has an impact. And then Always important to remember that you don't have to exercise by walking or running. You can certainly swim. And in this particular study, the adults with type 2 diabetes and hypertension, 2 hours of swimming 3 times a week for 16 weeks, dropped blood sugar, lipid cholesterol panel, and blood pressure, as well as body fat. And then you may have seen this. This was in The Week, one of my favorite magazines to read because it summarizes all the world news in just a few pages. And what they said here is there is no way for humans to consume meat in the way we are doing without abetting catastrophic warming. And then lastly, I always like to point out that we are making some change little by little. This is one of our Ornish outcomes, and every year they're published and have very similar results. But in the intensive cardiac rehab program I oversee, we take people who have heart disease and we put them in an immersive program that teaches them how to exercise, how to eat plant-based. We even give them a meal. We talk about and implement stress relief and group support. And that magic recipe has enormous improvements in outcomes. People lose weight, their cholesterol drops, their triglycerides drop, their blood pressure drops, their hemoglobin A1C, a measure of diabetes, drops, their depression melts away, and their exercise capacity increases. And this is shown time and time and time again. So a super powerful way to get people better. The sad part is right now, insurance only covers it once you're sick. So bottom line, after all of this, you can see that there is just, and these are not all of the studies that were published, this is just a good selection of studies, but there is an enormous amount of data out there that is saying that a low-fat, 100% whole grain, minimally processed, whole food, plant-based diet is really the secret to not only our continued success on the planet, but our overall health. And of course, Albert Einstein, my favorite quote, says, "Nothing will benefit human health and increase our chances of survival for life on Earth as much as the evolution to a vegetarian diet." And then for those of you that are interested, Walk with a Doc is now a very big national program. Highly recommend you consider checking it out. We do it here in Denver, and it is truly eye-opening how nice it is to walk with patients and not have to deal with the usual hospital and clinic, co-pays and gobbledygook. You get to walk side by side with patients, and it's lovely, and I encourage you to check one out because there's probably one in your neck of the woods. And then we even have a transitioning to plant-based virtual support group run by a really lovely dietitian, and you can find this on the National Jewish Health website. It is on Zoom, so you can attend it from anywhere in the country if you like, and it's great for people who have questions and are trying to make these changes in their life. And if you're not convinced, do your own research. At the end of the day, reading for yourself, seeing for yourself is often what people need. They really need to feel inspired. So watch Chef AJ, read books, learn, and get excited and empowered to improve your health and stay healthy. And with that, I've left some time for questions.
All right. Thank you so much. After I watch this, I feel like saying, is there nothing that plants can't do? One of the things I heard you say in another presentation that I love is the longer the shelf life, the shorter your life.
It's true. Yeah, and the truth is, we see this even with plant-based foods. So if you look at like processed carbs, right? They're white carbs, and the more processing, the longer the shelf life, but they tend to shorten life, as you heard me say earlier. So, in short, it's always important, right? If you can get something fresh that's right off a tree from the produce area, whatever it may be, the likelihood of it maintaining and helping your health is more.
Great, thank you. So people actually sent in questions, but I don't want to miss this one from the viewer named Jay Goodman, especially because I have 2 nephews with that name. I wonder if that's one of them. But he or she asked, what is the best source of powdered plant protein? I don't know if you even recommend powdered plant protein.
Yeah, so there are selected individuals. So I take care of a number of athletes and weightlifter types, and they're always looking for ways to get additional protein in their diet for their muscle building. Or there are many health conditions that are what are called catabolic, like cystic fibrosis, or some of the mycobacterial infections and other things like that I see. And these people tend to waste calories. They just burn them up and they have to eat constantly. And so traditional nutritional advice has been things like, go eat sticks of butter, or, have a dozen eggs every day. And the truth is, these people are now living longer than ever and then developing heart disease as a result of those recommendations. So when somebody is looking for extra protein and they can't get it through unprocessed foods, I usually recommend looking for a pea-based protein, which seem to be readily available. And there are some other plant-based proteins. Just be careful you're not getting too much salt or too much fat or too much oil or additives. There's a number out there, Orgain, Vega, etc. But in general, I only resort to those when people are really finding that it's difficult to maintain weight or protein intake. And you could also certainly eat buckets of spinach and kale and get similar amounts of protein.
Great. Dr. Freeman, I don't know if I ever heard you speak about your journey to discovering a plant-based diet personally. Do you mind sharing that?
Yeah, no, happy to. So I grew up in New York, and never really understood why all of my friends growing up, their parents were all either dying, unfortunately, or had heart attacks or cancer. And I think about our diet where I grew up, it was, 3 or 4 inches of cream cheese on a bagel. If you went to the beach, you always stopped and got bagels beforehand, and there were, lots and lots of cream cheese. 7 inches of pastrami. A piece of pizza weighed 5 pounds. And so that's how we ate. We ate like kings, incredibly high fat, highly processed, carcinogenic foods. And I filed that away in my background, went through training, didn't get a lot of nutrition or lifestyle recommendations, came out to Colorado, started practice, and like everyone else, threw pills at people for a while. Then I started the Walk with a Doc program, and then I really started to look at nutrition. And, we were taking a family vacation up in Steamboat, Colorado, which is a ski resort town, and in the summer it's even lovelier. And we ate dinner at a greasy burger place, and then I was finishing at the time, I think it was the China study, and I finished it that night, and I was vegan ever since. I just said to myself, my goodness, how did I not know all this? How did I not get all of this information and data to make decisions well before this? And then I started doing it with my patients, and the results were extraordinary. And then personally, I actually redid my life insurance physical about 3 months after doing this and got a rebate check in the mail. So it really works. And for my patients, especially where I work, so I work at National Jewish Health, which is a big time respiratory hospital that takes care of a lot of rare conditions, and all disease shares one common endpoint, which is inflammation. And if we give our bodies an anti-inflammatory environment through the way we eat and live and so forth, it has a chance to heal. And so people's asthma gets better, or their interstitial lung disease stops progressing, or their coronary disease stops progressing, or their diabetes goes into remission. And there's nothing more powerful than watching people's disease go away with lifestyle as opposed to drug, which is pretty great.
I love that. Dr. Alan Goldhammer says if you're Jewish, the KKK will kill you. Knishes, Kreplach, and Kugel.
Well, that may be true. Knishes are technically, some of the Knishes are technically vegan. So you can probably get away with those on occasion, but again, they are highly processed.
Absolutely. Well, here's a question that was sent in from a viewer named Susan, and I actually think it's such a good one. I might save it for all the doctors because she talks about how, she's read all the documentaries and books and how they say that a plant-based diet always addresses how we can prevent and reverse disease so that we don't have an early death. But she wonders, what do whole food plant-based people die of and when?
So all people die, all right, unless perhaps you're a vampire or something like that. And we still die from the same thing. So remember, at some point, your body will give out, right? So, my guess is if you were to look carefully at all of your possessions and you're 70 or 80 years old, let's say, chances are you have very few things that are 70 or 80 years old. They just don't last. And the human body is similar. So people die from heart disease, they die from heart failure, they die from cancer. It still happens, but it happens later in life, and many times it is not as virulent or powerful as some of the disease if you were to say eat hot dogs every day as an example. But people die from everything, even if they're plant-based, even cancer, even heart disease. The goal, of course, is for all people to live until the last day they're supposed to be on the planet, and then just leave, peacefully at home if it's possible. But again, still people die in the hospital that are plant-based. Sometimes people even have accidents and die. So.
Yeah. When you transitioned, were you able to get your family on board easily?
Yeah, so the truth is most of my family was always interested in being vegetarian or close to, and these days my entire family for the most part is plant-based. I would say that for the children, dairy, so milk, cheese, butter, yogurt, typically in the form of birthday party pizza or ice cream or something, is difficult to fully eliminate from their diet. But if one of them said to me, Dad, I want to try a burger or something, I certainly wouldn't stop them. But none of them have ever wanted to because they understand where it comes from. My favorite moment was when my now current 11-year-old, and we have 4 kids, we went to a farm to visit the animals so we could see them and how they live and feed them and stuff. And he saw a turkey just kind of roaming around, and he said, Dad, I see this turkey here. It's gigantic. It's beautiful. It's got all these big feathers, but where do all the dead turkeys come from that people eat? Like, he didn't realize that they had to be killed. And I think once he put two and two together, he hasn't eaten a piece of meat ever. So
I love that story. What a great kid. Thank you. One of the live viewers are saying, really, can interstitial lung disease go away with a dietary change? Is there any documentation for
So,
that?
yeah, so I didn't say go away. I said stop progressing. Remember that with advanced lung diseases, sometimes the goal is to halt progression. We may never be able to cure it. So I have yet to see, fibrotic lung disease that's been scarred down for years and years fully go away, but I have seen the disease slow or even halt in its progression, which is pretty amazing.
Great. Thank you. This is from Carol. She says her adult son has hemochromatosis, high iron. He's interested in changing to a cruelty-free lifestyle, nutrition, but is concerned about all the leafy greens and other veggies which are high in iron. What can he eat that won't be too high in iron?
So the truth is that a lot of the fruits and vegetables that are higher in iron also contain many other nutrients that are beneficial, and so you may not need to eat large servings of these. But typically, hemochromatosis which is surprisingly common, by the way, does lead to iron overload, and it needs to be managed and monitored periodically by a physician. So what I would recommend is that you switch to a predominantly plant-based diet, and maybe you don't eat piles of kale, spinach, and broccoli unless you want to. And it is possible, just because the amount of iron per, say, leaf is not the same as, say, like a bite of chicken would be, that you might be able to get away without significantly having very high iron levels. But even still, particularly in men, right, so women who have hemochromatosis have the advantage, at least until menopause, that every month they lose blood. Men are not as fortunate in that particular regard, and as a result, they may need to periodically either give blood or have iron removed from their blood. So,
Wow, that's interesting. So Jill says she heard you give a lecture at the PCRM conference in which you stated that a whole food plant-based diet could cure heart failure. Is that true, or does it just improve ejection fraction?
well, I guess it depends what you mean by curing heart failure. So heart failure can be broken down into a number of things. So many people would say when someone is congested or volume overloaded that they're in heart failure. And then the heart failure that we typically deal with is heart failure reduced ejection fraction and heart failure with preserved ejection fraction. One means that the pump works normally, and the other means that it's not working normally. The truth is, if you look, plant-based diets have effects on all versions of heart failure and even volume retention, typically because they don't contain salt and they create that anti-inflammatory environment. But not all people that have heart failure will be cured, depending on what your definition of cured is. Almost everybody will get better, and many people will have a full recovery, but not everyone. And it really depends on what the cause of heart failure is. So for instance, if you've had 10 heart attacks and a good chunk of your heart muscle is dead, I can't get that to recover. Whereas if you have heart failure, say because your blood pressure has been so poorly controlled for so long and we change your lifestyle, that is a very good chance at recovery. So it really depends on the etiology of the heart failure and what kind of heart failure it is and how extensive people make their lifestyle changes. So I know that's sort of a political answer, but the answer is it helps, and in some people it cures, but not everyone.
Couldn't hurt, right?
Right.
Okay, thank you. Sharon says, Dr. Freeman, I was recently diagnosed with atrial fibrillation and prescribed an anticoagulant and a beta blocker. I've been eating whole food plant-based for 15 months. I'm 65, 10 pounds from goal weight, have normal blood pressure and cholesterol, and no other medical conditions. I have 3 sisters with similar conditions. Is AFib the result of my previous lifestyle? Is it reversible, or will it always be there?
So a bit of a loaded question. So for those of you that are unfamiliar, atrial fibrillation is when the top part of your heart beats erratically, and the greatest risk is it poses is it can create blood clots, which can cause stroke. And the truth is, once you have AFib, you sort of always have it, even if you're not in AFib. And so being on a blood thinner, when appropriate, is the right thing to do to reduce the risk of stroke significantly. If you look, what are some of the common causes of AFib? Well, some are genetic, some we don't know, and a lot of it has to do with high blood pressure and the stretch it goes on the left atrium, the top part of the heart where AFib typically originates. And so there's been lots of data over the years that shows as people lose weight, their AFib burdens go down, or they have less incidence of AFib as a result of that. So I guess what I would say is it is certainly possible that it's your prior lifestyle. Also, chronic stress can do it, sleep apnea can do it, all the things that typically afflict Americans sadly can predispose us to AFib. But I would also tell people that a lot of people are like, well, I'm plant-based, I'm going to skip my blood thinner. there's really never been a study that shows that following a plant-based diet can reduce the risk of stroke in atrial fibrillation. So please stay on your blood thinner unless your doctor tells you otherwise, but be smart about it. And then for those of you that are plant-based that are not on a drug like Eliquis or Xarelto or one of the newer drugs, you may be on a drug like warfarin or Coumadin. The age-old advice has been, oh, you need to avoid vitamin K-rich foods like all the green leafy vegetables. What I would tell you, that's not exactly right. Coumadin or warfarin are vitamin K antagonists, and so if you eat vitamin K, you can cancel it out. But if you eat a consistent amount of green leafy vegetables every day, we can find a dose of Coumadin or warfarin that will work. So make sure that that nuance is known if you're on one of those drugs.
Great, thank you. Susan says, Dr. Freeman, are annual cardiac exams necessary for those who had a heart attack years ago? It's difficult for me to have the traditional stress echo test because on the treadmill, it's a real challenge to get my heart rate sufficiently high. Therefore, the Lexi scan is the alternative.
So firstly, you shouldn't be having a routine stress test every year unless you're having symptoms. So I hate to say this, and I'm not trying to talk disparagingly about any other colleague, but if you're having a routine stress test just because, you need to find a different clinician. That is not guideline directed. So what I would say is a general cardiac checkup every year is not a bad idea because it lets us measure your blood pressure, make sure your weight is staying where it's supposed to. If you've had a heart attack in the past, I always recommend at least a yearly follow-up because you're always at risk. And I would say that, unless something special is going on, a routine stress test just because is not necessarily needed, and definitely not every year. So definitely take that into consideration.
Great, thank you. Jesse's commenting the information on vitamin K and leafy greens and blood thinners is very important.
Oh no, it's absolutely. I've definitely taken care of people who are trying to change their diet, and so their cardiologist has told them to never eat green leafy vegetables because they're on Coumadin, and they're living on cheese, which is just opposite of what anyone would want them to do.
Have you made any headway with your fellow colleagues at all, especially cardiologists?
I had the honor of founding the American College of Cardiology's Nutrition and Lifestyle Work Group, and so we have slowly grown over the years, and there's 60, 70, 80 what I would call enlightened cardiologists. But I would say that all of the people that work with me or near me, many times, especially when I first started, would make fun of me or still make fun of me to this day. But the results that I'm able to achieve with patients, or that patients are able to achieve independent of me, I should say, speak for themselves. And so many of the people who were sort of saying, oh, this won't work, or were skeptical, I think are now believers. So I think we have made many people make changes. And as this has become more and more mainstream, particularly in medicine, more and more people are coming out of the woodwork and self-identifying or calling me up and saying, hey, I love what you're doing. I love that you put, a lifestyle comment in every one of your notes. And now I am too. So yes, it is happening, but it is slow. And remember, it is opposite in some ways to what we learned, right? When we're in medical school, very few of us are getting any nutritional lifestyle training. It's always sexier to do a procedure or give a fancy new drug. But I would say that lifestyle really works, and I don't think we were ever meant to be as sick as we are.
Yeah, but lifestyle doesn't pay.
Well, it can, right? So, now that we have switched largely to time-based billing when we're in with our clinic patients, if you're seeing them for whatever it is, high blood pressure, prior heart attack, etc., and you spend your whole time talking about lifestyle, it's time. So it has changed, and it's doable now.
Nice. Well, I just want to let you know, Lisa, who's watching live, who is a whole food plant-based Yankee fan, says, I am mesmerized by Dr. Freeman. So much outstanding information. I love data and facts. And I was talking to Dr. Freeman before we logged on about maybe coming on more regularly. So hopefully we can look forward to seeing him again. Have you ever noticed how bad they feed cardiac patients in a hospital?
I have, and actually myself and a few of my colleagues around the country have published on this. We have gotten plant-based menus, and if you're in a hospital or you have a friend or a family member, ask for a plant-based menu, and if they won't accommodate you, ask to speak to the head dietitian, and typically they will find something. Most hospitals have the ingredients, they just don't always have them together.
That's so true. This is a really interesting question from Marilyn, because I think about how nobody gets lung cancer from smoking one cigarette, but over time it's cumulative. So she's saying, that she's been mostly, I love when people say mostly plant exclusive with her eating. Then that's not exclusive, it's mostly. There are days where she still caves and eats something that is high in fat and sugar and highly processed, such as a Costco cake. I used to love those back in the day, or something of that sort from the bakery. My question is, how long does this high fatty, sugary food stay in my body? How long does my blood and cholesterol levels stay elevated? How long does it take to eliminate this for my body to be back to my normal, healthy level? How much of a setback will this cause to my health efforts?
You know, the truth of the matter is, right, we all occasionally indulge with a sweet or whatever, and I recommend, okay, or almost everybody occasionally indulges. Some people have iron willpower like Chef AJ. But what I would say is, when you indulge, try to indulge on non-carcinogenic foods. So sadly, the Costco cake is highly processed flour with eggs and FD and C red and blue and whatever other frosting and whatever in there. So try to skip that. And you can find a plant-based cookie or, lower fat frozen dessert. I love frozen bananas as an example. And see if you can eat that instead. Come prepared. If you're going to a party and you're going to need to eat a piece of cake, find yourself some sort of health, or bake something that's actually not that high in sugar that still tastes good. But I guess what I would say is, everyone is transient, but we know that after eating a very high-fat meal that the endothelial cells that line the blood vessels sort of shut down for a while. And everyone is variable. So if you said to me, well, how long will my cholesterol be high, or how many points will I couldn't tell you. I would tell you that if you're interested in this, one of the guys that has pioneered in this space is a guy named Bob Vogel, who lives here in Colorado, and you may have seen him on The Game Changers. He was the guy who did some of the work with erectile dysfunction in men, in addition to other endothelial cell experiments. He was the guy who did the cheeseburger experiment and then monitored endothelial cell function. So I would say do your best to really limit it. And then, like I said, if you said to me, you know what, I'm going to grab 20 grapes and skip a piece of cake, great. But the more you can go that way, the better. And the more prepared you are, the better. And then be wary of what I call once in a while syndrome. Well, I only have hot dogs once in a while, I only have cake once in a while, I only have this once in a while. Before long, every day is a once in a while, and then you'll be back where you were. So the goal is really to try to eliminate altogether. And I myself have tried, it's for the last 11 years now, to have not a single animal-based item. And of course, I am sure that I have been at a place or someone's place where they forgot, or it was there, or whatever, and I may have had something. But in general, I try my absolute darndest to avoid it at all costs. And then, like I said, when it comes to sweets, yes, we all cave. Somebody brought me those Trader Joe's Scandinavian Swimmers the other day. I don't know if you ever had those little tapioca-based gummies. Those are unbelievably addictive, so I literally had one and gave the bag away before I could finish it.
Good for you for doing that. Has anyone ever asked, somebody having a heart attack what their last meal was? Because I don't, I'm not a doctor, but I remember hearing, Tony Soprano, James Gandolfini, that his last couple of meals before his fatal heart attack was something like, fried seafood and foie gras and alcohol. Yeah. I mean,
so the question is, right, when is your bad habits finally going to catch up to you? What's the straw that breaks the camel's back? I don't know if anyone knows the answer to that, but if you go to, for instance, that heart attack grill in Las Vegas, which you may have heard about, where, if you're obese and past a certain number, you get a free meal, people have actually had heart attacks there. So, the question is, can that be a trigger? And I think the answer is definitely yes. Has it been well characterized about, how many cheeseburgers can you eat before you've crossed that threshold? I don't think so. It certainly would be great to know, because you can imagine like a warning thing. It's kind of like how a bartender won't serve you if you're noticeably intoxicated. Maybe it's like, sir, you really shouldn't have that third double cheeseburger. But
oh God, that's something. Susanna says, I 100% support Dr. Freeman's presentation. How does he suggest getting this information across to teens and young adults who are clearly invincible? They don't listen to the death and illness statistics, sadly.
It's harder to reach people who are sort of, in their invincible years, right? Because you could do almost anything, and many things stupid like we all might have done when we were teenagers, and somehow survive, right? Kids seem to survive accidents, they seem to survive dumb choices, and so it's hard for them to see a consequence. What I always tell people is, if you're the matriarch or the patriarch in your family, and they watch you and what you go through and what you do to change to get better, and you get better, that's always a great example. And then I'm a big fan of using data and understanding. and show them the documentaries, have them watch Forks Over Knives, have them see Game Changers where young people are doing better. If they're athletic, people do better when they eat a plant-based meal. If they see the effect on the environment, which I think is unquestionable at this time, right? We are in a major global warming period, and people are starting to notice that there are big problems, and the future of the planet is not so much in our hands, but in their hands, right? And so the more that we can teach them now, the more understanding and activists to become, the better. And so bottom line is, I think leading by example is important. Having good options available, even if they're less healthy. I would tell you that these days here in Denver, you can go for a plant-based version of anything you want at a nice restaurant, and they're delicious. And that may be a better option than the traditional. And then the next step is to say, well, if you like that Beyond Burger or Impossible Burger, come try this veggie burger I made and see how well it tastes with the seasoning I put on it. So I think there's always ways to get people to kind of get there. And I would say one of my greatest experiments, and has worked a lot, is, if I'm at a cardiology meeting with a bunch of fellow cardiologists. We were in Vegas once for one of these. We went to some restaurant out for dinner. I pulled the waiter aside or the waitress aside. I said, hey, how is your chef here? Oh my goodness, she's the best at the whole city. I said, oh great. Well, I have a cardiologist who says that I can only eat low-fat, whole food, and plant-based. Can you see if your chef can make a vegan option without too much fat or salt? And sometimes the chef will come out and talk to you, and sometimes you'll get the best thing on the table. So when they were all eating like beef carpaccio, I had watermelon carpaccio, and it was amazing, right? And everyone's like, I want to try that, right? And there was like 15 people at the table, so I got nothing. But at the end of the day, people like to see that it's doable and how I do it. And I think leading by example is the best way, and knowledge is truly power.
Yeah, I love that story you told about your son, because, you're not going to tell an 11-year-old, you're preventing heart disease and diabetes, but the fact that he could make the link between the ethical part with the turkey, that it's good to have more than one reason. You know what I mean?
Well, right. And I always look for those sort of motivational hooks. Like one of my examples of a patient was, I had a 40-year-old truck driver who, had terrible cholesterol and high blood pressure. And he said to me, Doc, I know you're trying, but I'm never really going to change, so just leave me alone. And I said, okay. And I would just check on him every 6 months. And then one year he found himself with a girlfriend, and he says, Doc, I have a problem. And I said, oh, tell me about your problem. And it turned out he had erectile dysfunction, and he wanted to get better without having to take medications. And that was the hook that I needed to get him to make this massive lifestyle change. And of course, 6 months later, all is well, right? So, how do you get people to, so you just keep looking for those hooks.
Wow. That's got to be the hard part, I think. That's why I would be so frustrated with people that aren't willing to change. I mean, if they were sick.
Yeah, no, I mean, I always ask for permission before I criticize anyone's diet or approach, but I think you're right. People are quite reluctant to make these changes.
That's my problem. I'm not asking for permission. Okay. Well, I've been vegan for 45 years and I know the truth,
Yes.
So Dr. Freeman, if somebody wanted to see you in person or virtually, I understand they have to live in Colorado, but what about this walk with the doc? Can I come walk with you sometime?
You can in Denver,
Okay.
but there is Walk with a Doc that's nationwide. So if people go to walkwithadoc.org, they can find their local chapter. It's actually worldwide, believe it or not. And then if you're in Colorado, we actually specialize in having out-of-state patients. So people spend weeks with us typically for more rare diseases, but I certainly get people who call up and say, hey, I'm looking for a cardiovascular risk reduction and love to meet with you, and happy to do that. So you can call up National Jewish or get in touch somehow. I'm online and social media, and certainly don't have the same social media presence as many, but life with 4 kids and a full-time job makes that difficult at times.
Well, I still appreciate so much what you do. And I love that people are seeing you for prevention, not, they're seeing you specifically for what you do.
Yes, well, no, I love what I do. And my favorite part of the day is when people come back and say, I followed you and I had my spouse follow you, and all of a sudden we are the best we've ever been. And that makes my day, because we don't really get to hear that a lot in medicine, ever, really.
No, absolutely. And you're doing it without pills, potions, and procedures.
Indeed.
Oh, thank you so much for your work. And please, people really loved your presentation, and they'd like you to come back as often as your schedule allows.
Yeah, I would love to.
Oh, thank you so much, Dr. Freeman.
You bet.
And thanks all of you for watching another episode of Chef AJ Live. Please come back tomorrow at the regular time of 11 a.m. My guest is Melissa Webster. She's going to be making a stretchy mozzarella cheese. And Dr. Freeman, I just have to read this nice comment from Dave. Shalom, you are a true mensch.
That's very sweet.
All right, take care.